All right, welcome on this lovely Maine evening. Now we know that Kinsey was quite well known for always having appropriate rain gear and for loving the cold, so mud season in Maine prepared him well. So welcome to the Kinsey Centennial Symposium, which is held in honor of the 100th anniversary of Alfred C. Kinsey's graduation from Bowdoin College. It was at Bowdoin that Kinsey began his academic study of biology, the field in which he went on to earn his PhD at Harvard and in which he became a professor, actually, of zoology at Indiana University in Bloomington. Throughout his life, Kinsey saw himself first and foremost as a research scientist. In the 1940s and 50s, he became best known to the broader US public, however, as a sexologist, as someone who studied human sexual behavior. And he did so on a scale that remains unmatched. Between the years of 1938 and 1947, Kinsey and the members of his research team conducted interviews and collected data on the sexual behavior of over 18,000 Americans, the findings of which were published in two monumental studies, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male from 1948 and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female from 1953, sorry. But 1953, imagine, in this country. Avoiding the concepts of normal and abnormal, Kinsey looked instead to what behaviors were common and less common, finding that many acts that were socially or morally condemned at the time, such as homosexuality, oral sex, extramarital sex, masturbation, were actually practiced by large segments of the population. He wrote about this in a sober and straightforward tone that presented these behaviors as perfectly natural. It was Kinsey's sober, objective approach that Alan Gregg, director of the Medical Sciences Division of the Rockefeller Foundation, which provided the lion's share of funding for Kinsey's research, praised in his preface to the Male volume in 1948. This is a quote by Alan Gregg that my students know quite well. Certainly no aspect of human biology in our current civilization stands in more need of scientific knowledge and courageous humility than that of sex. The history of medicine proves that insofar as man seeks to know himself and face his whole nature, he has become free from bewildered fear, despondent shame, or errant hypocrisy. As long as sex is dealt with in the current confusion of ignorance and sophistication, denial and indulgence, suppression and stimulation, punishment and exploitation, secrecy and display, it will be associated with the duplicity and indecency that lead neither to intellectual honesty nor human dignity. That's the end of the quote by Alan Gregg. Kinsey's work was courageous and pioneering, and it certainly makes him one of Bowdoin's most influential alumni. He belongs, to be honest, on a short list of Bowdoin graduate that includes Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Robert Peary, Joshua Chamberlain, George Mitchell, Joni Benoit Samuelson, Geoffrey Canada, but that, it's sort of the top 10 that we can think of. And it's high time that we, as a college, acknowledge that and engage in a public discussion of his work, the influences on it, and its legacy. And because I see an alum in our midst who said to me just a couple of weeks ago, I have to share this quote because I love it. Thank you, Tony. Kinsey was a great American. If it wasn't for Kinsey, we'd all still be wearing chastity belts. I don't know if we'd all be right, but we have to think about the gender politics of that. But I love that quote. Before I introduce our keynote speaker this evening, I'd like to thank the departments, programs, and organizations that made the symposium possible. First and foremost, my co-organizers, Marilyn Reisbaum and David Hecht, the Dean for Academic Affairs Office, the departments of German, English, and History, and the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Special thanks, she's here, she's hiding behind that door. Sarah, come out. Special thanks to Sarah Eddy in the events office for supporting and publicizing this event and for keeping us on task and on budget. And speaking of those who've kept me on task, a large portion of our audience for the symposium is made up of my students from the course Making Sex a Science. And over the last 13 weeks, they've explored a myriad of topics, the impetus for and ethics of sexual science, the complex lives of those who practiced it, and cultural representations of sexologists like Magnus Hirschfeld, Alfred Kinsey, and Masters and Johnson. And they've done so with an admirable mix of intelligence, good humor, and sensitivity. So I thank them for their critical acumen and for treating the course material with great dignity that would have done Alan Gregg very proud. Finally, thank you to our impressive group of invited scholars, the first of whom I'll now introduce. So as I've mentioned, Kinsey was a pioneer in the US context, but he was influenced, whether he liked to admit it or not, by late 19th and early 20th century European sexologists, most of whom hailed from German-speaking Europe. And it's that connection between the German context and Kinsey's work that our keynote speaker, Annette Timm, will highlight in her talk. Timm is one of the leading scholars on the history of sexuality in 20th century Germany. As the editor of the Journal of the History of Sexuality, she's also responsible for vetting and disseminating some of the most important scholarly work within sexuality studies as a discipline. An associate professor of history at the University of Calgary, she's the recipient of numerous Canadian and German grants and fellowships. I will not name all of them. She's done impressive curatorial work. One of her particular grants and fellowships is an Insight Development Grant awarded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada in 2012 for her project called Eros in the Archive, a collaborative project that explores the influence of Magnus Hirschfeld, the German sexologist, on Alfred Kinsey through images found in the Kinsey archive and in popular culture. Her scholarly monograph, entitled The Politics of Fertility in 20th Century Berlin, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2010, and an edited volume, a collaboration with Michael Thomas Taylor and Rainer Herrn, her research partners for Eros in the Archive, that's titled, quote, Not Straight from Germany, Sexual Publics and Sexual Citizenship Since Magnus Hirschfeld, will appear very soon from Michigan University Press, the University of Michigan Press. The second edition of her book, entitled Gender, Sex, and the Shaping of Modern Europe, which she co-authored with Joshua Sanborn, is about to be published by Bloomsbury. In all of her work, Annette Timm deals with some of the most difficult and controversial topics within the history of German sexuality: prostitution, venereal disease, eugenics, her book project, her next monograph on the Lebensborn program in Nazi Germany. She does so with intellectual rigor and integrity. She does not sensationalize, nor does she try to smooth over any ethical edges or try to gloss over ethical questions. She exemplifies, to keep using Alan Gregg's words, the courageous humility that serious research on sex and sexuality requires. And it's my pleasure to welcome Annette Timm to Bowdoin. Please join me in doing so.
Well, I'm almost a little teary-eyed after that introduction. Thank you very much. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm going to start with a couple of admissions. I feel a little bit sheepish in presenting this research about one of Bowdoin's most illustrious students, because what I'm going to say might seem like I'm trying to take Kinsey down a notch. It's not true, and I wait for the conclusion. But, you know, historians like to look in the shadows of, and perhaps particularly historians of sexuality, and I will be doing that a little bit. The second admission is that this project doesn't come from a book project. It comes from an effort to do an exhibition. And I will say something about why I think that's relevant, but it does make me feel a little bit concerned when I'm speaking to an audience full of Kinsey experts that I'm leaving something out that is obvious. But I'm hoping that what I'm going to do is tell you something about Kinsey that you don't all already know. Okay, so to begin, I'm going to talk about a woman who was familiar to Kinsey in the 1950s. I'm so grateful to all of you men of medicine who have been so good to me. These words of gratitude appear in a January 1954 letter from a 49-year-old trans woman to the endocrinologist Harry Benjamin, who had helped advise and treat her before and after her sexual reassignment surgery, or gender-confirming surgery, if you prefer that term, at the University of Calgary, the University of California, San Francisco, in December 1953. The woman, I'm going to call her Carla, and Benjamin exchanged close to 100 letters between 1953 and 1956, and they discussed every detail of her physical transformation and her relationships with the other transvestites, that is the term that she used, in California. She was friends with Louise Lawrence, now probably known to many of you and to historians as a central figure in the network of trans individuals who were seeking surgery in 1950s America. The two of them, Carla and Louise, were part of a close-knit group in San Francisco and the surroundings, and they cooperated with Benjamin to find research subjects for Kinsey's planned book about transsexuality, a project that was interrupted by his death in 1956. Unlike Christine Jorgensen, the glamorous ex-GI, who in late 1952 became a media sensation and later a cabaret star after having undergone gender-confirming surgery in Copenhagen, Carla purposely and successfully preserved her anonymity, which is why I continued to do so and give her a pseudonym. Carla was one of the very few transgender Americans to have procured surgery, some in the US and some abroad, most abroad, in defiance of rulings of the state and district attorneys in Wisconsin and California, who relied on British common law statutes which were meant to protect the health of potential soldiers, in other words, to prevent soldiers from injuring themselves to avoid military service. And they used those statutes to prevent genital surgery on any kind of healthy tissue. They called it mayhem. In Carla's case, she took matters into her own hands with a sharp knife and then managed to acquire reconstructive surgery and the full deal. Having just met Louise and another trans friend in October 1954, Carla wrote to Benjamin, "Couldn't the newspapers have made a sensation of the meeting of the three of us if they'd have known? As near as we can figure, we almost had a quorum. 3 out of 9 of us in the US, as near as we could think. In other words, 3 out of 9 Americans who had had surgery." Carla, who would later become a professional photographer, then took pictures of the group in Louise's living room and sent the slides to Benjamin. It was the discovery of these beautifully evocative slides in a box of vacation photos in the Benjamin collection at the Kinsey Institute that provided the inspiration for part of the exhibition that I'm curating very soon, way too soon, in about 3 weeks, with Michael Taylor and Rainer Herrn at the Nickel Galleries in Calgary. These images led us to Carla, and Carla has much to tell us about the intimate and personal networks that provided the foundation for knowledge about transsexuality in the 20th century. I'll return to Carla at the end of my presentation, but first, what do I mean by intimate and personal networks? How could a term like this possibly describe the work of 2 of the most important sex researchers in mid-century America, an era that was famous for its clinical and depersonalized approach to medical dilemmas and individual emotions? To answer this, I'll start in Weimar, Germany, and I'll draw on the intimacy of those letters that Carla wrote to Benjamin. Carla was one of Benjamin's first trans research subjects and a key source for his 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomenon. This book basically made him famous, and he became sort of the leading expert in what we would today call transgender identity. What did Benjamin, and through him Kinsey, learn from Carla and her friends? The genesis of our joint research project, Michael, Rainer, and I, and the exhibition, was our curiosity about how the categorization of transsexuality that was first developed by Magnus Hirschfeld and his associates at the Institute for Sexual Science in Interwar Berlin might have been transmitted to Alfred Kinsey. This was just a hunch. We wanted to figure this out. Hirschfeld had founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in 1897, often considered the world's first gay rights organization, and he was the author of numerous influential books and articles about the spectrum of human sexual diversity. It isn't really that original to say that Hirschfeld was one of Kinsey's predecessors and that Benjamin provided a link between the two men. But if we look a little closer, we see that the precise nature of that influence has not yet been fully appreciated, and the suggestion made by Benjamin himself somewhat disingenuously later that it was American researchers who first used the word transsexuality in a way that we would use it today is simply untrue. It was Hirschfeld. Our exhibition, which will be called Trans, is focused on the question of where knowledge about transsexuality originated and how the transmission, translation, and transgressive potential of this knowledge traveled. So transgressive, translation, transmission. We are tracking this transmission through both theories and imagery from Europe to North America. I think the fact that the stories I will tell you today emerged out of this research for an exhibition rather than a book project is actually significant. There's something about knowing that you'll have to tell compelling stories that will be approachable to a public audience. In other words, that you'll have to be concise, not add footnotes, all that kind of stuff. It focuses one's mind into finding the most significant threads of transmission and to finding probably juicy interpersonal connections. But I want to argue that these connections are critical to understanding how knowledge, and particularly knowledge about sexuality, is created. We began, as historians too often do, with the idea of following a thread of the transmission of ideas from one prominent man to another, Hirschfeld, Benjamin, Kinsey. We expected that Kinsey must have somehow drawn on Hirschfeld's research, and we expected to base our exhibition on a small archival treasure, the Hirschfeld scrapbook, which we knew was housed at the Kinsey Institute in Bloomington, Indiana. We were disappointed to discover that the scrapbook, which is a scattered collection of letters, reports, and published documents from Hirschfeld's years as a researcher and gay rights activist, had arrived at the Institute after Kinsey's death, so an archival dead end. Somebody had found the scrapbook in Nice in 1959 after Kinsey was dead. And obviously, Hirschfeld died in Nice as well in 1935. So archival blind alleys, however, are often things that one is later grateful for. This one helped us to discover that the simple trajectory from Hirschfeld to Kinsey that we had been thinking about was ill-advised, that we were missing the real story here. So here's the awkwardness I warned you about, that I won't really be celebrating the great man in what I'm talking about here. So I'm arguing that the interesting story is not about these great men. What is more interesting is this story of these trans individuals who taught these great men something about themselves, and I'll return to that. Kinsey did know about Hirschfeld, and he cited Hirschfeld's books in both his two monumental best-selling books. Monumental is a word we always use when we talk about those books. Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, 1948 and 1953. After this, I'll just talk about the male and female book. But he was fairly dismissive of this early German sexological work for reasons which I'll explain. It was only after that he'd begun a collaboration with Harry Benjamin that a significant German influence on Kinsey can be said to have taken hold. Too late for Kinsey to have worked through the implications and include this perspective in any published work. So if he never published it, why was his influence significant at all, you might be asking yourself. Kinsey hadn't had any trouble making a name for himself without it. His two books were an immediate sensation. The male book had gone into 6 printings 10 days after it was released, and the two together sold hundreds of thousands of copies and were translated into numerous languages. The publication details on his books are remarkably difficult to track down, but let's just say hundreds of thousands. I want to argue that although Kinsey did not live long enough to publish his research on transsexuality, how and why he embraced the subject at all has much to tell us about the scientific study of sex in the 20th century. The overarching point here is that Kinsey did not find transsexuality as a subject of scientific investigation. Individuals who wanted to be investigated found him. In many cases, and Carla was one of these cases, they found Kinsey by first finding Harry Benjamin. And this is the dedication on that image is to Harry Benjamin. Benjamin had also only become interested in trans individuals because they had come to him asking for help. In other words, to accurately track the transmission of knowledge about transsexuality, we have to give up our tendency to view sexuality as something that can be discovered. This goes against Kinsey's own self-perception. He believed that his research was based on scrupulously objective scientific criteria and that his conclusions were free of any major errors of selection bias or subjective influence. And yet, if we pull back the curtain on key areas of his techniques, his research techniques, we find that his gendered biases kept him from accepting the existence of transsexuality until very late in his life. It was only through developing long-term and quite intimate relationships with individuals who were seeking to change their sex that he started to change his mind. a process, I believe, that would have led him to reevaluate some of his assumptions about sexual dimorphism, the supposed unbreachable and natural difference between male and female if he had lived. So my story starts in Germany and then eventually crosses the Atlantic in complicated ways. And now I'll talk a little bit about the transmission from Hirschfeld to Benjamin. Like all sex researchers who followed him, Hirschfeld tried to project a scrupulously scientific aura to the world. So we're back in Berlin and Germany now. But things looked a little different behind the scenes. Much of his data about sexual diversity was gathered by making connections with the patrons of the various bars and cafes in early 20th century Berlin that catered to individuals seeking to escape the oppressive heteronormativity of German culture. The most famous of these bars was called the El Dorado, and you see on the right Hansi Sturm, who was a transvestite, that's the word used at the time, performer. So the El Dorado was the haunt of gender non-conforming individuals of all kinds. There's a unique atmosphere, in other words, in Berlin that fosters this kind of information. Because Hirschfeld had these close relationships with anyone who conceived of themselves as sexually non-conforming, he was contacted by people who would otherwise never have made themselves known to medical authorities. His 1910 book, Die Transvestiten, The Transvestites, was translated into English much later, I think in the 50s or 60s, I think, was based on letters and communication with 17 individuals who wrote to him about their desire to live in the clothing or the body of the other sex. In the opening pages of the book, Hirschfeld admits that the life stories of these individuals initially surprised him. Despite his openness to the idea of sexually mixed types, Mischungsarten, for those who speak German, he found these individuals strange and disconcerting. It took him 10 or 12 years of knowing the same individuals and reading completely independently written autobiographies before he came to accept these people as a distinct type. He said, during my observations of the first cases I encountered, case 10 and 12, I still thought that these could be cases of self-delusion. End quote. These unique individuals forced him, he wrote, to supplement his objective observation of large data sets with intense involvement with this very small group of individuals from Berlin's flourishing interwar sexual subcultures. This one picture from the Institute gives a sense of what I'm talking about. So we don't know the precise origins, what was going on. There's no caption for this image, but it's in the Institute. It could have been a play, it could have been a masquerade ball, but I think the intimate relationships between the people are just visible in this image. Okay, so now we move across the Atlantic, or we kind of get stuck actually in the middle of the Atlantic. Benjamin emigrated to the United States from Germany somewhat by accident in 1913. He'd been on vacation and wanted to take the ship home, but it got turned around in 1914 because of the beginning of the war. He ended up deciding to stay and make his way in the New World after spending some time in confinement, actually, for being an enemy alien. And he established himself as a specialist in endocrinology and rejuvenation therapies for aging, following the research of Eugen Steinach. Steinach had performed a series of famous experiments on guinea pigs where he transplanted gonads in order to both rejuvenate the animal and to transform its gender characteristics. This primitive form of hormonal treatment struck Benjamin as a new panacea for aging, and he made his way out to California with the goal of selling this miracle cure to the rich and famous. This Steinach's research was also made into a popular film, which led to many individuals writing and asking for this kind of treatment for reasons of trans identity. So Benjamin kept returning to Germany to gather more knowledge about endocrinology, and that led him to an engagement with sexology. Benjamin met Hirschfeld in 1907 when a girlfriend introduced him to Police Commissioner Kopp. The story of the police commissioners in Berlin and their personal and very tolerant relationships with gender non-conforming people in Berlin is also one of the personal networks that I won't go into, but is part of the story as well. Benjamin went to Berlin every summer in the 1920s, and he accompanied Hirschfeld on his jaunts through Berlin's nightlife. Bemused that the famously grumpy and stingy Hirschfeld had earned the nickname Tante Magnesia, Aunt Magnesia from the adoring patrons of these clubs, Benjamin took mental notes on how scientific knowledge about sexual diversity could be gathered in unconventional personal contacts with gender-questioning individuals. Although Benjamin never denied the influence of his German mentors, he would later claim to have invented the term transsexuality in his highly influential 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomenon. But which of these men should get credit for coining the word is not really the point, because they did not discover sexual diversity. Sexually diverse individuals instead discovered Hirschfeld and Benjamin, and later Kinsey, and they taught these men what their personal experiences might mean for our larger understanding of the spectrum of human and gender experience. Okay, now I'm skipping wildly ahead to the 40s and 50s in the US. In the meantime, Benjamin struggled. His rejuvenation practice didn't really work out. It doesn't really work. And he was looking for other paths to establish himself as a researcher and a medical practitioner. And he looked to find these connections to Kinsey. After beginning to correspond with Alfred Kinsey in the spring of 1944, Benjamin finally met the famous biologist, he says, sometime around 1945. And the two men began comparing notes about gathering sexual data through personal contacts and visits to bars and nightclubs like this one in San Francisco. Kinsey had referred an effeminate boy who totally baffled Kinsey. He referred this boy to Benjamin, knowing that Benjamin was conducting hormone treatments, and they began sharing files of people that they generally referred to as transvestites. In September 1949, at precisely the same time that Benjamin started to address his letters to Proc, Kinsey's nickname, rather than to Dr. Kinsey, the correspondence between the two men became much more intimate, with frequent descriptions of the personal lives, medical quests, and intertwined social networks of Americans who were seeking hormone treatment and surgery. Throughout the early 1950s, Benjamin reported to Kinsey on his frequent visits with a circle of intimates around Louise Lawrence during his yearly summer residence in San Francisco. So Benjamin lived in San Francisco in the summer and New York in the winter. And he forwarded all of the information about these contacts to Kinsey. Kinsey then came out to interview these people, often making special trips just to interview one or two. And also became very intimately involved. So the letters back and forth between Kinsey and Benjamin really describe this the personal relationships, who's mad at whom, all of those kinds of things between these individuals. And a lot of them were in San Francisco, also in Chicago and New York. Whenever Benjamin and Kinsey were in the same city, the two men went out to explore establishments they thought most likely to be sexologically interesting. Their common interest in this kind of research is apparent in their letters. In a letter dated September 1951, for instance, Benjamin reported that he'd taken a fascinating tour of the seedy bars of Mexico City. He expressed the hope that Kinsey would be able to join him on a similarly sex-citing trip in the future. Sex-citing is a word actually that comes from Albert Ellis, for those of you who know the other circles of sexologists around this time. In other words, Benjamin was following in the Hirschfeld tradition, and he'd found a kindred spirit in Kinsey, whose loitering in seedy areas of Chicago and other cities had already gotten him arrested or nearly arrested on several occasions. Kinsey's writing does not describe what was essentially a methodology of anthropological fieldwork. He describes his interview method in great detail, but he says nothing about how he found his most sexologically interesting interview partners. As Donna Drucker has argued, who's sitting in the audience, Kinsey's self-perception was as a taxonomist, a gatherer of masses of data that could then be categorized and analyzed. But the precise pattern of gathering information about transsexuals that his correspondence with Benjamin reveals suggests that he would have had to revise his standards for mass data collection in order to complete his planned volume on transsexuality. He simply didn't have the numbers for a reasonable sample. The subject of transsexuality might have even forced him to at least somewhat revise his views on what Hirschfeld would have called intermediaries, the various shadings between male and female. So here's just a map from Hirschfeld of these shadings. The only word up there that you probably have never seen is metatropism, which didn't really catch on. One of Hirschfeld's many efforts to coin words, he also coined transvestite and transsexual. Metatropism means that the woman is active and the man is passive instead of the other way around, which is more natural. In the male book, Kinsey rejected the idea of fixed sexual types. He particularly detested unscientific uses of the word bisexuality, which he said had been, quote, used to imply that these persons have both masculine qualities and feminine qualities within their single bodies. He refused to ever speak in terms of fixed sexual identities. He wrote only of homosexual acts, never of homosexuals. And despite his own creation of a scale of human sexuality, he placed far more emphasis than Hirschfeld on social conditioning. So did Kinsey specifically engage with Hirschfeld's theory, or did he just reject it? This is unclear. Kinsey insisted that terms like intersex and bisexual could only be used for humans in ways analogous to biological descriptions of animals who possessed both male and female anatomical structures. Those who engaged in homosexual behaviors then were not physical or sexual intermediates, but rather examples of the limitless human capacity for variety in sexual comportment. This was a rejection, I would argue, of Hirschfeld's theory of sexual transitions, though it wasn't explicit. He doesn't talk about this, which posited that variations in sexual organs, physical build, sex drive, and emotional makeup produce a clearly categorizable, that's a hard word, if also theoretically infinite variety of sexual types. All people, Hirschfeld said, both male and female, all people have both male and female characteristics on a spectrum, and Hirschfeld argued that pure male and female poles were only ever really ideal types. They didn't ever actually exist. Kinsey acknowledged Hirschfeld's pioneering efforts, and he was particularly respectful of Hirschfeld's psychobiological questionnaire, which had questioned 7,500 Berliners about their sexual practices in 1903, 1904. But Kinsey ultimately dismissed Hirschfeld's work as failing to meet the sampling standards of scientific population analysis, something that Kinsey himself was later accused of, as some of you know. He scoffed that much of Hirschfeld's information was, quote, nothing more than gossip. And he seems to have ignored Hirschfeld's theory of sexual transitions altogether. So Kinsey was not a careful reader, we know. He was rather haphazard. Possibly he just didn't ask his German translator to read those specific books from Hirschfeld. We don't really know. But it's instructive, I think, that Kinsey cites but does not comment on Hirschfeld's 1910 book about transvestites. Kinsey was clearly uncomfortable with any theories of sexual diversity that might threaten a gender order based on sexual dimorphism, the natural distinction between male and female. He acknowledged that men and women are, quote, alike in their basic anatomy and physiology. But as Janice Irvine has argued, his insistence on the biological imperative, I should probably get a Kleenex. Sorry, I just came down with a cold literally after getting off the plane. Thank you. But Janice Irvine has argued that his insistence on the biological imperative has the ring of someone desperate to justify the double standard. As Kinsey put it in the female book, quote, the human male's interest in maintaining his property rights in his female mate, his objections to his wife's extramarital coitus, and her lesser objection to his extramarital activity are mammalian heritages. They're in nature. Women, he insisted, had less sexual capacity and were less malleable to social conditioning. They had less conditionability than men, and were therefore less likely to seek a variety of sexual experiences. He uses this also to explain why, as both he and Benjamin believed that transsexuality was much more common in the male to female direction than the female to male direction, which we now know is true, but they believed at the time. He had no problems finding ways of making the massive amounts of data he collected fit these preconceptions. But after having referred that first transsexual patient to Benjamin in 1944, and having begun their 8-year collaboration in research into transsexuals, Kinsey was faced with dilemmas that would challenge both his insistence on mass data collection and his sexually dimorphic worldview. I think this is the same person, by the way. I'm not absolutely sure. You can judge for yourself. By the time Kinsey died, there was only a handful of publicly acknowledged transsexuals in the US. Of course, there were many more. There were thousands of letters written to anybody who was publicly out as a transsexual. Christine Jorgensen, for instance, said that she received something like 20,000 letters, many of them just in praise, but some of them desperate people seeking the same thing that she had undergone. Benjamin and Kinsey were determined to find as many of these people as possible, and they believed that they knew of all of the medically registered cases in the US. But by the end of the 50s, Kinsey only had 100 histories of male to female transsexuals and 11 female to male cases. And they only knew of 10 cases of surgery, so only one more than Carla had reported 6 years earlier. This was nothing like the data set that Kinsey had relied on to write his male and female books, which, as Jill just told you, were based on more than 18,000 case studies, and for which Kinsey developed a punch card system of a machine analysis. The sheer dearth of cases might itself have left Kinsey more predisposed to the kinds of information gathering techniques that Benjamin had learned from his German mentors. But two other factors were important. First, perhaps in part because of the critique he had endured after his initial book, that he had been unwilling to discuss cross-dressing or transvestism. He left it out entirely in the male book. It's not mentioned or only mentioned. The word comes up once in relation to Hirschfeld. And only in a list of words. He only added a few paragraphs about it to the female book. So Kinsey, maybe in response to critiques about that, took very detailed histories of the trans cases he found, and he traveled long distances, as I've said, to meet with just one or two individuals. He had a 4-hour-long interview with Carla, which is double the average length of his interviews. And Carla found him to be a lovely and sympathetic man, as I think many of his interviewees said. Despite his antipathy to psychoanalytic methods, his methods of investigating transsexuality were much more personal than statistical. And in his early speculations about categorizing these individuals, he tended to opine that, quote, no two of them are very much alike, which is a bit of a problem for somebody who wants to come up with a taxonomy. Second, the tendency to view cases of transsexuality more personally had a long history in the United States, arising, of course, from the need for secrecy in an era of police persecution of any kind of non-conforming gender comportment. In other words, people could simply be arrested for dressing in the wrong gender. The earliest description we found of these personal networks that began to form in the US is provided in a 1914 article by the New York gynecologist Bernhard S. Talmy, who was also a German immigrant, in the New York Medical Journal. Talmy describes an exchange of letters between 5 transvestites, 1 German, 3 American, and 1 British, in the first decade of the 20th century. And Talmy explicitly referred to Hirschfeld's book, about transvestism. His account begins with a description of a German man, Mr. S., whom Talmy had known, quote, in a social way for years without having detected any gender abnormalities. In other words, he didn't know that Mr. S., who he'd known for 10 years, was a crossdresser at home. We now know that this man was Otto Spengler, and that Benjamin met him in Germany in the 1920s. Talmy reprints Otto's biography and the letters of these 4 transvestites, which share very personal details. Talmy just basically describes how they dressed and what they did in ways that are quite unlike his other writings, where he railed against masturbation and things. In other words, Talmy was a rather conservative person who you would not have thought to write about, would have written about transvestites in a rather sympathetic way. Talmy concedes that what he calls a sexo-aesthetic inversion of pure artistic imitation, a kind of clothing fetish is really what he's saying here, has nothing to do with homosexual attraction. And Kinsey repeated this argument in the female book, even though that first transsexual who Kinsey had referred to Benjamin, Kinsey had said to him, had told Val, is the pseudonym I gave that person, to undertake homosexual relations as a means of learning to value his genitals. So in 1944, he's telling people, go be a homosexual. By 1953, he's changed his mind, right? Homosexuality has nothing to do with this. And he took that idea he doesn't have that much evidence in the book. It comes mostly from Talmy and the few cases that he had investigated with Benjamin. Kinsey cites Talmy's various books 21 times in the female book, and he gives the same biases as Talmy about clothing fetishism being the root of transvestism and about a much lower incidence of female to male transsexuality. It's probably likely, I would argue, that Kinsey knew that the first patient that Talmy was talking about was Otto Spengler, because Benjamin sent a file of information about Spengler to Kinsey in 1947. So there's a link here. Kinsey's interest in these individual cases and his rather undocumented reliance on them in the female book indicate how important it is to understand the role of personal networks in the formulation of knowledge about sexuality. Given the much smaller size sample, he listened carefully to the words of individuals and appreciated their self-representations in all of their complex and sometimes contradictory richness. He was dependent upon the social network between these people simply to find his research subjects, and both he and Benjamin inevitably became involved in the tensions, joys, disappointments of people forced to live secretive and emotionally intense lives. While it's impossible to predict where this work would have led him had he lived, there are hints in the letters to Benjamin that Kinsey could not have easily sustained his conviction that transsexuality was just one more example of male-female sexual dimorphism. But what I want to highlight today is that this very personal involvement between scientists and an extremely marginalized sexual minority demonstrates the unique way that knowledge about transsexuality, and maybe even all sexuality, was assembled and transmitted in this era. Go back to Carla. Members of the close circle around Louise Lawrence virtually all corresponded with both Kinsey and Benjamin, and they were keen to influence the scientific knowledge about their conditions and its preferred treatment. Carla viewed herself as, quote, doing missionary work for our cause. She described herself having responded to, quote, the psychiatric interns who sometimes become well-known and prominent psychiatrists who flocked to her bedside after her 1953 surgery. She said, the more medical people sympathetically interested in transvestism, the better. She wrote that to Benjamin in 1954. Carla was also keenly aware of Kinsey's own biases on the subject of sexual response. Kinsey's obsession with counting orgasms is well known. He defined sexuality as the potentially unlimited capacity for sexual release, a potential upon whose fulfillment culture and society only acted as negative forces. In other words, in terms of moral prescription and repression. But his own repressed childhood, his father railed against masturbation, and his troubled early marriage, he and his wife had to resort to medical advice to consummate their marriage, probably contributed to his valorization of the male orgasm as the most obvious, not to mention the most countable, manifestation of human sexual capacity. These preconceptions were likely the origin of his initial reluctance to accept the existence of transgender individuals. He simply couldn't imagine anyone removing an organ of such massive orgiastic potential. I'm stretching a little bit there. I'm guessing that was one of his problems. Carla seems to have gleaned this bias from her long conversation with Kinsey, or maybe from her own reading of him. And she reported, after having briefly been married in May 1955, that that her husband understood, quote, her shortcomings, which are not as short as one could think. I am able to bring him a more nearly normal satisfaction than even I could have believed possible. And there's several times when she mentions physical satisfaction in her letters to Benjamin. And then she explicitly says, by all means, tell Dr. Kinsey. She wanted that information to be passed along. So I believe these individuals were aware that they had to prove to Kinsey that there was some sort of sexual satisfaction in their lives for Kinsey to understand and be sympathetic to their cause. Carla was also planning to follow Louise Lawrence's example of assembling a scrapbook for public education. She never did, but she planned to. This missionary work, as she called it, is also apparent in the slides that she sent to Benjamin. So these images come from these stereoscopic slides in the boxes that we found in the archives. Carla was permanently broke in these years, and she had to scrape together the money to have these images developed and mailed. Interestingly, as I have some reason to believe, I have to verify this information, but I think she later made millions of dollars in microphotography with mapping the silicon on chips in the Silicon Valley. But at this point, she was broke. She and her friends clearly hoped that these photographs would portray their successful integration into everyday life, and they wanted to convince Benjamin and Kinsey that their desires were valid and that medical intervention could be successful. Carla's devotion to the cause of scientific inquiry is also evident in the nude pictures, so slight warning here. She sent Benjamin and to the fact that she allowed him to use them in his 1966 book. Now, I always hesitate a little bit to show these images. We are going to show them in very careful ways in the exhibition. I did show them uncensored when I just gave a similar presentation at the Moving Trans History Forward conference in Victoria, but I have to say that I'm in the US. Things are not going so well in this country. I censored them a little. Sorry. Compared to the medicalized images in the book, which is the one on the far right, that's the image for the book, the private setting of these poses calls out, I would say, for us to accept normality. Back to the living room pictures. The images are personal, they're playful, they're intimate, and they express the joy of transformation and personal fulfillment. Although he left behind no definitive statements on the subject, given the evidence I presented today, I think that it is likely that Kinsey, too, had begun to see transsexuality as within the spectrum of normal. In quotation marks. In a well, or not, because he used the word. In a 1949 article that he co-authored with his primary collaborators, Pomeroy, Martin, and Gephardt, he tried to tear down preconceptions of normal human sexual development, arguing that the term crimes against nature had no scientific grounding and simply punished acts that individuals found satisfying and where there was no damage to property or persons. Kinsey's sympathetic reaction to Carla and her friends makes it seem unlikely that he could have continued to reject the validity of their desires, in other words. The transition in Kinsey's thought is visible in the few paragraphs he wrote about transvestism in the female book. Unlike the first, the second volume does provide a brief definition, and it coyly alludes to research underway, quote, to secure a sample which will ultimately allow us to estimate the number of transvestites in the United States. But the book was published in 1953, just before Louise Lawrence and Carla had started forwarding cases to Benjamin in earnest, and before Kinsey's 4-hour-long interview with Carla, or just around the same time. It's not surprising, therefore, that Kinsey's understanding of transvestites, he never used the word transsexual, was dependent upon his understanding of the fundamental difference between males and females, and his assumption that, quote, males are more liable to be conditioned by psychologic stimuli. We have to look a little deeper in the pages of the female book to uncover the transformation that was in progress in Kinsey's approach to transsexuality and its implications for his understanding of the gender spectrum. In this book, as opposed to the first volume, Kinsey felt compelled to address, although skeptically, the science of endocrinology, which was Benjamin's specialty, and which was the origins of transsexual surgery through the experiments of Eugen Steinach. While admitting that endocrinologists were among the special consultants for his project, and that, quote, hormones may have more effect on bodily functions than any other mechanism except the nervous system, Kinsey warns that popularized knowledge about the impact of hormones was quite incorrect. Oops, sorry, I didn't show you that living room slide. I will pause briefly and get my nose drips. So this is where he's talking about endocrinology in the female book. Journalistic accounts of scientific research, over-enthusiastic advertising by some of the drug companies, over-optimistic reports from clinicians who have found a lucrative business in the administration of sex hormones, and some of the discussions among state legislators and public administrators who hope that hormone injections will provide one-package cure-alls for various social ills, have led the public to believe that endocrine organs are the glands of personality, and that there is such an exact knowledge of the way in which They control human behavior that properly qualified technicians should, at least in the near future, be able to control any and all aspects of human sexuality. That was, in fact, all one sentence. He then goes on to minimize the effect of hormones in general and to decry the common usage of distinguishing male and female hormones. His purpose in fostering doubt about the science of endocrinology, however, becomes clear when he alludes to another of his ongoing research projects, institutional sexual adjustment, in other words, sex in prisons, mental institutions, boarding schools, things like that. For Kinsey, the conviction that hormones drove sexual behavior had justified intolerable abuses, such as the castration of sex offenders. This skeptical approach to hormone treatment must have led to numerous debates with Benjamin. So some of the arguments in this quote are exactly what Benjamin did. It also means that two of the 5 major projects he was working on when he died were on a collision course. The other 3 projects were sexuality and art, sexual factors in marital adjustment, and the influence of drugs in sexual behavior. It's difficult to say how that conflict between the transsexual argument and the argument about institutions would have played out. Would Kinsey have been persuaded by his intimate relationships with a relatively small number of transsexuals who were desperate for hormone treatment and who thrived once it was administered? Or would he have insisted on maintaining his taxonomic and statistically rigorous methods until the birth control pill came to shatter his preconceptions about female sexual capacity? Who knows? But I hope that I presented enough evidence to demonstrate that if the great taxonomist had been so influenced by intimate contact with his sexual subjects, then it's likely that interpersonal exchange has always been and will remain a feature of the creation of sexual knowledge. So just to briefly sum up a little bit of what I'm saying here. First of all, I think we have to pay attention to 3 things: to the international connections of this history and how intricate and intertwined they are, the personal networks involved, the fact that Otto Spengler and I could name a few others turn out to be a linchpin for a lot of these stories. This is something that's often kind of hidden in books where everybody's anonymized and we don't really figure out who they are, right? What Kinsey discovered, in other words, already existed. He simply counted it. They found him rather than the other way around. And third, none of this makes Kinsey's accomplishment smaller. It shows his humanness. It hints that he was likely to change because of his empathetic reaction to these individuals. And this is something that was often commented on. Although he was a gruff and demanding and often egoistic man, he felt true empathy for his interview subjects, often brought right to the end to tears when other of his colleagues had become kind of bored. Orgasms were his first idea, and this was based on his very male experience and the repression he had experienced. But trans people were starting to teach him something about his biases. And I would argue they have a lot to teach us as well. So I leave you the image of looking in a mirror. Questions?
Hi, I can start us off. I was wondering about another connection to the European world that's on a more of a meta level. I'm struck, I feel a lot of someone like Kraft Ebing, his informants also are they want their story told. And also now we can go back and we can find out who some of them are. And there is this little, it's not just an objective, like, I found someone who was in some way, unusual. No, they came to me and I kind of knew them. And I'm just wondering if you have more thoughts on that as a kind of larger context of the way sexual science is created.
I think it's very common, and it's hidden from view, because all of these people, Krafft, Ebing, Hirschfeld, Kinsey, all of them needed to present themselves as objective scientists, right? So they never talked about these things. They didn't reveal it. It was known in Berlin that Hirschfeld went to these bars. He had these connections. He was visible. He was known, but he never presented himself. He never outed himself as a homosexual, though he was a gay rights activist, because it would have diminished his scientific credibility. It would have shown him as biased. And in fact, Kinsey, I think, believed that as well, that he had diminished his work through his activism, right? So I think it was a very difficult thing, and rather impossible for them to talk about these things. And the other thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is that we easily reproduce that. So when historians look at all these cases and we continue to anonymize them, and we continue to we continue to make them cases, we lose that thread. You have to know that Otto Spengler, who is now, he's named usually, but then you have to find him, and which historian, which pseudonym did that historian give, and so you have to track the stories becomes very difficult, and we reproduce that kind of refusal to acknowledge the personal relationships in our own research.
But it does, I was thinking of the same thing in terms of the case history, the whole, the Kinsey saw himself as someone who really departed from these personal case histories, and that sort of structure for the sexological text. But yet, if one speculates about what this book might have looked like, it would have brought us back to the case histories, anonymized as they may have been, but that might have been the only way to deal with it.
This is my problem. Even in 1966, I think Benjamin's book was based on 500. So he came up with his own scale of transsexual, transvestite to transsexual, and those kinds of things. He tried to reproduce in some ways what Kinsey had done, but on a much smaller number, and it fails, I would say, because what was really interesting were these individual personal stories, which you only know if you can track who Carla was. So this image, this one, the top left corner there, that is reproduced in black and white in Benjamin's book, along with the medical image. So, but you don't know that was taken in somebody's living room and sent to him individually, right? So. Yeah, I think it is just very difficult to do the same kind of statistical analysis on these very individual cases. And they were all aware of how different they all were. There was nothing to categorize here, or it was very difficult. I think they had to stretch themselves to come up with those categories, and they weren't fixed. They changed over time. Some of them wanted surgery and then didn't, and it changes.
Thank you. I learned a lot. One question I'm interested in thinking about was you had various metaphors for kind of the sociality of these groups throughout the talk. You talked about the network. You talk about intimates. You talk about the circle. And I was curious to know, each of those metaphors for sociality, which I agree. I see them in each of these relationships, but each kind of evokes something slightly different to me. So I'm just curious to know your own kind of thought process with these metaphors. I think the intimacy is really important to these social worlds. I guess another word I would use is like purient interests was a really big issue for a lot of these people. We don't have purient interest in these topics, even though there is a lot of eroticism. Anyway, so I'm just curious to know the language of these metaphors for the social.
I think actually, again, those words, those are really influenced by the fact that we're doing an exhibit. So one of the things that we're going to put in the exhibit is a kind of cosmos, a network and we literally did it. My husband does information architecture. So he put all of the connections. We had all of the people, all of the institutes in Berlin, all of the doctors, all of the individuals, all of the publications. We're going to show things from publications and put lines. And the initial network was way too complicated, right? Like so that's interesting in itself that that from Berlin to New York to San Francisco, London, Havelock Ellis in between, and other people, Christine Jorgensen in various places. That there's so many lines and from these people who are unknown to us, like Otto Spengler, right? But have all of these connections to these, so we're literally showing it as a map of connections, and that's why I use the word network. But I think you're right. You're very right to say that we have to distinguish between the medical relationships, the intimate relationships. How I say intimate. How intimate were these relationships? I mean, Carla, as far as I know, stops writing to Benjamin in 1955. She goes on to be a successful photographer. She goes on with her life. You know, it's not, I don't think that they're sending each other Christmas cards for the rest of their lives. I don't know. But so but I think intimacy is important. I think because she literally shared with him, Arlene, one of the others, is mad at me. She's not talking to me anymore. Like they're really personal details. They're not simply medical organizations.
Had these serial intimacies. Like it seems like at different points in his career, he had these buddies, right? And they have these really intense relationships. And then eventually the buddy doesn't want to go on the next road trip, and they break up. Like I can name other ones, and they have these. So I'm not saying Christopher, and then they kind of deny they were friends. Like there's others.
Yeah,
and so it's interesting. Like, but there was this really intense relationship.
And of course, a lot of this has to do with police repression, right? They have to be intimate because they have to be trusting, these relationships.
Thank you, Annette. How much do you know? I know Kinsey had photographers, and I wonder how much you know about the mediators. I mean, one of the questions about Hirschfeld is who were the people taking, who were the photographers? I mean, he received photographs, he got them. He himself was not really a photographer. So I wonder how much you know about the mediators of these photographs, or if we know.
Well, so the photographs that I showed you were all sent to Benjamin. Right? It was the individuals themselves, which is also true in the Weimar Republic. So in our exhibition, we're also showing images from the Drittes Geschlecht, which is the third sex, a magazine for transvestites. And all of those images were mailed in by the individuals. And then they're often judged by the magazine. So here is how a transvestite can dress inconspicuously, and here's how a transvestite shouldn't ever dress. You know, but all of them were submitted to the magazine. Kinsey's other images are hard because the image collection, there's a lot of them, but they have no provenance. They're privatized. So a lot of times we don't know. I mean, you can follow in the letters where he's gathering things. And so sent me these pictures from Chicago and those kinds of things. But he gathered them in a way that makes it very difficult to say for historians, who, where, why, what. You know, they're sort of there for him, and some of that information is still confidential.
Thanks. I enjoyed that, and I absolutely agree that, I mean, whatever intimacy or circle or network or whatever is very important in understanding what Kinsey and Benjamin and everyone was up to. And I guess what I'm curious about is, where does that leave us in terms of understanding what it is that they actually produced, right? Because it's clearly something other than the objective, detached, scientific thing it's promoted as, right? That the production process is more personal and more complicated, right? So then what is it? Right.
So this is a lot of people who know more about Kinsey could speak to this, because on one level, he just simply refused to accept the cultural constructedness of these things, right? I mean, he himself didn't contextualize what he was seeing in that way, even though, as I described it, what he's doing is kind of anthropological fieldwork. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm caught in that contradiction myself about what that has to say about his research. I mean, I think obviously some of his numbers have stood up I think that in the case of transsexuality, it's particularly difficult because it had to be even more secretive, even more taboo, even a lot of laws around these kinds of things. But yeah, I think I'll just leave your question as as currently unanswered. I think it's one of the fascinating things about this particular case study in particular, because he was forced to go to a case study approach, even though he totally rejected it.
Hi. I was wondering, you mentioned that I think Carla wanted, or like, I guess, thought that it was important to reach out to these scientists, but I was wondering what you think these people were hoping to gain from reaching out to the scientists. When you also mentioned that they couldn't actually categorize themselves and, having their own, like seeing their own changes within their lives. So kind of like, yeah, where do scientists come in for the people who reach out to them?
I think they knew very specifically what they wanted. They wanted surgery, they wanted help, they wanted to be more feminine. So Carla, for instance, writes at one point that Arlene or somebody else has taken these hormones and she's a C cup. And I'm definitely not. Can you do something for me? I really want to be I think she's exaggerating. She can't possibly be a C cup. But, so she's a lot of the letters. So I picked out other things here, but a lot of the letters are about face creams and treatments and hormones and how to deal with the hot flashes and things. It literally is an effort to achieve the medical results that they want. And I have to say that's not so different today, right? People still need to prove things to scientists to get the treatment or the medical interventions that they want. Did she care about the words? She calls herself a transvestite. She herself at one point talked to the Mattachine Society, which for gay rights, to try to educate people. I don't think in the end she cared very much about Benjamin's scale of transsexuality or anything like that. She wanted to live, and Carla I find interesting because she was anonymous. She wanted to live as a woman. She at some point loses her job as a nurse because she doesn't know why, but she assumes because they figured it out. And she wants to live anonymously and pass as a woman, and she sees Benjamin as a path to doing that.
So I'm really interested in what you were just saying, because having read Lawrence's correspondence, it's very clear that the stories they're telling are carefully curated, that they are not just essential truths, but they are working the medical scientists to get them what they want.
Mm-hmm.
As well, there's another catch of information that they are passing along to the scientists, which Whit and I, it's the porn. Lawrence.
That's true, but that's more true of Lawrence. Far more true of Lawrence. It's not true of Carla, but yes, go on.
So Lawrence becomes this conduit for this massive dump of transsexual porn,
Bondage
and bondage, sadomasochism, corset wearing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of this whole panoply of erotic desires that don't fit in what the scientists want to say.
Mm-hmm.
And Kinsey very nicely packaged it up and put it to the side and never really dealt with it.
Yeah, it's true.
And so I'm hoping that you'll say something about this, how they're packaging two separate stories, one of desire, one of essential femininity, which is how I think a lot of trans activists at that moment were speaking about themselves, for different audiences.
Yeah, unfortunately, I chose not to write about Louise Lawrence because others have. So I shuffled through her folder, but haven't read it in great detail. I would say that to answer that question, you'd have to look at Kinsey's files on his art project, right? He's also going around Europe trying to read the sexual themes out of European art just before he died. Literally, I think he dies within a year of coming back from a 2-month trip to Europe. I could be wrong about that, but around there. And so I haven't looked at that stuff, but I think that's where you'd have to go to figure out, because Louise Lawrence is literally, yeah, there's a lot of art. It's really, it's not just pictures of women in corsets, it's drawings, and she, which Lawrence does herself. So possibly, my hunch is that she might have also been the inspiration for Kinsey's foray into art, but that's totally speculative.
So Kinsey had like his ways of interviewing his people in the male volume and the female volume. So I'm kind of really interested in the ways these interviews went down, because I mean, I guess you didn't talk about it so much, but like he has plans when he goes into interviews, but with these, I guess it's more confusing. So
I wish I knew. So we can't actually see those individual interview records for anyone, right? Did he go in with his same score sheet kind of thing? Probably, but then he spoke for another 2 hours. So I can only speculate really about what that conversation looked like. There is also in the file of documents on Carla, there's also a 8 or 9 page biography of her life that she composes to send to Kinsey. So I think I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't have enough information to really explain what happened in that interview room. But I do think it's significant that it was twice as long as what he usually did, and that it produced this massive amount of letters between him and Benjamin, and back and forth with these individuals that I don't think his other interviews did, or a few of them, a few famous cases, right?
Yeah. So sorry. This is really loud. Yeah. So what we've learned about Kinsey is this kind of his philosophy on sexual research was this kind of overwhelming or overarching diversity. So I was kind of confused when you talked about him that he would have this bias towards transsexuals, just because that seems like right in the line with his idea of these intermediaries. Or, and I was wondering if you think this, you mentioned that this could go from his childhood, his upbringing, or if this is because it directly goes against what he just published or his views that he was trying to propagate.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I'm going on tiny bits of evidence here, right? I mean, he literally has a page and a half about transsexuality in the female book, and that's it. So when you look at all the places where he talks about Hirschfeld, he doesn't really engage with this spectrum. And he mostly in the female book, he mostly talks about Hirschfeld's discussion of masturbation. So he seems, I don't know, I just sensed a tentativeness because I knew what was going on behind the scenes. I knew the conversations that he was having and the struggles and the antipathy or he didn't really accept this whole hormone treatment thing, right? Which is what all these people want. So I read that 1953 book as on the cusp of a change, that he had ideas that were simply wrong, that would have been proven wrong very quickly. For instance, that female to male is only what I think he said 5% of cases or something like that. Well, that was true at the time, but that's just because that's what they knew, right? So a lot of what he was really basing his key arguments on there was based on knowledge that was very soon to be proven wrong. Not to mention that this hormone treatment did have, for these individuals, very important and wanted effects. So I agree. I think it's messy, and I'm going on very little evidence to make that case. I'm speculating about where he was going.
And just building on these questions, isn't it possible that Kinsey's interest was really in sex and not in gender identity? And it's the same kind of effect that many gay and lesbian rights activists or sexual rights activists now are having in the face of the new trans wave, which is a disorientation because it's not really about sexual desire. It's actually about gender identity. So he was as a passionately curious person, he was like, okay, tell me about this.
Yeah.
Let's take 4 hours.
Yeah.
But it really wasn't his shtick, right? I mean, that's my guess, right? I mean, it seems like we're living through another moment of that kind of transition where there's a really two utterly different passionate desires. And that's just a sense of maybe what's going on.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think Carla sensed that, which is why she emphasized to Kinsey through Benjamin that there was sexual satisfaction in this relationship.
Okay, so this now leads to my question to you. How much did sexual difficulties or desires come up at all in the material that he amassed on the trans people he talked to?
Nothing that I know of.
So isn't that intense? So Carla is the one source. So all the other letters that are being written to Benjamin, are they any of them talking about that quaint term, sexual adjustment?
So here's where I go back to my initial confession, right? I mean, I found Carla. I tracked her. I did not go back to the Kinsey archive, though I want to, and find any correspondence with any of the others.
So tell us more about what sexual pleasure, Carla, you think is feeding his ego or his interests for strategic reasons of her own. But what does she say about sexual pleasure exactly?
She says that she can bring her husband sexual satisfaction and that she's very happy about it, that they're planning another surgery to improve that. So it is discussed.
So that's about her pleasure.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Her pleasure is inhabiting her identity,
that's
which
right.
is a perfectly legitimate, intense thing. But it
that's
is
right. And so then the question,
anything that Kinsey would recognize is what he was after.
Exactly. So that's the question. So you're right that this is another way in which the Transsexuality project moved outside of the bounds of but he was still doing it. This is a thing. This is what I'm trying to emphasize. He was putting an enormous amount of energy into this. He went to San Francisco just for this reason, So we can only.
Well, he wasn't incurious, which is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
But it wasn't where his own.
Yeah.
Changed him.
Again, I think he was moving into a conflict.
Thank you for a great presentation. So I just want to point out that Kinsey's published data only utilized 10% of his 18,000.
Oh, wow.
So he was planning to publish 7 additional publications.
Yeah.
So I just want to say, because in a way that I agree with one of the audience mentioning about Kinsey was extremely interested in the range of either behavior or diversity. So what I'm thinking that this is still for him being as a taxonomist that finding different behavior or
even if it's rare,
he was extremely interested, and that's probably why he immediately turned this case to Harry Benjamin, wanting to have a collaborator, wanting to understand. So I just want to mention the fact that he was extremely interested in collecting, but he probably won't be able to make any conclusion just because he did not feel that he had enough data.
Right. And that's very clear in the female book. Right. We will say something about this when we have enough data, is basically what he says. He doesn't feel like he's got anywhere near enough.
Right, that's true. So the other thing I want to comment on, because you mentioned about the individuals and the cases, identities. I think that was something that he was hoping to, that's his first promise to all the 18,000 individuals, is that their identities will be kept confidential. Because otherwise, imagining, who else might be sharing anything about their intimate lives at all. So I think that there is a conflict, isn't it? I think all the historians coming to Kinsey Institute always wanting to know who is this person. And I think that's something that should be asked, but couldn't be asked at the time. And I think that for all the Kinsey scholars, that is a very interesting road that you have to travel. And I appreciate the challenges. And I think that in terms of Kinsey's circumstance and his vision of complete confidentiality, I mean, even to this day, that was one thing that he asked his colleagues, even if they no longer work at Kinsey, their promise is forever. It's not while they were at Kinsey.
Yeah.
So thank you for a great.
Thank you.
Thank you for this great talk. What's interesting to me is that as I worked on Kinsey, I really struggled with what his conception of gender was, especially since gender, as we're using it now, is kind of anachronistic since it wasn't even coined as a term until after his death. And so I came to find in Kinsey's work on gender, or as we think of gender now, is that he found there was some difference that was rooted in neuroscience, that there was some difference in the brain chemistry that led to differences in gender selfhood or expression. And I'm wondering if there's anything in the correspondence between the trans individuals and Benjamin and Kinsey about the possibility of ideas of trans selfhood as being rooted in brain chemistry or in neuroscience, or do they just focus on endocrinology?
That's a good question. I'm racking my brains. I'm pretty sure Carla was a very intelligent, interested person, as I hope I made clear. And she does speculate in a couple of places in her letters to Benjamin about that, but I honestly can't remember exactly what she says. Why do I feel this way? Where does this come from? There was, I have to say, she had. I can give you some of the other details about her life later, but there, she does manage to get the surgery for two reasons. First of all, because she'd already done it, and second of all, because she had a childhood where she had a slight anomaly, not an intersex anomaly, but something that people thought was, and she was initially brought up as a girl, and then switched to being a boy, and disappointed her mother greatly when that happened. So in some sense, in Carla's case, those kinds of things didn't need to be discussed in great detail because there had been this history. But there are probably places where she talks about brain or where is this coming from, and it would be, yeah, I'll have to look again now to figure out what she says about that.
Could you say something about Carla's tattoos, which
are
kind of out of control, but also they're clearly designed to be hidden, and it's also body modification.
So that image in the top left, the caption, I should have brought the caption. I didn't want to talk too much about Benjamin. The caption that Benjamin puts there is that the tattoos were a desperate attempt to masculinize herself, which failed. She, however, I know just very anecdotally, and this is literally from a doctor's blog on the internet. So this is, somebody said that, that she had a later surgery for gallbladder or something and called for a plastic surgeon to carefully put the tattoos back together. So she never just, if that's true, she did not disavow the tattoos. So this, yeah, the tattoos are interesting, which obviously it makes those images compelling, and I just ignored that in this talk. But I'm glad you asked that.